Check 1, 2. In the book, we talked about Barton's accusation that we recruited Jay Richards. Well, of course, he contacted us, and you didn't know him, right?
No,
Yeah.
I knew of him. I'd heard of him before I think he had done some work for the Discovery Institute.
Right.
And I think I'd seen the name prior to that.
Yeah, by the way, I'm here with Michael Coulter, co-author of Getting Jefferson Right, and we are in McDonald's of Grove City. This is where the book Getting Jefferson Right kind of started. I was working on it, and I really needed another set of helping hands, and so Michael was grading papers.
I was, and I was also on sabbatical. I was also working on editing a project. That was my spring of 2012. I had a sabbatical, and I was finishing a big editing project and a smaller writing project, and that's when it would have been in like February, I think, of 2012.
Wow, was it that late?
Yeah, might have been March. I don't know.
Well,
No, it might have been February. It must have been February.
because we came out with it in May. I mean,
That's right.
It was kind of a short turnaround.
Yeah.
But I know I had some questions about the 14th Amendment, I remember in particular, and church and state issues. But anyway, back to I was talking about Jay Richards and Barton's accusation that we recruited him. And so, you just knew him from the Discovery Institute or knew of him.
I kind of heard the name before.
Yeah, and I didn't know who he was, and so he contacted us. But before that, Barton then also said that we were recruited by secular guys. Now we're going to play this video of him saying that.
And so in this case, secular guys have been going after me for a number of years. They couldn't do anything because we had so many documents. So the secular guys went and recruited some Christian professors who then came after me, and that made national news because now I'm being attacked by my own people. So at that point, I had done this book on Jefferson, which has 2,000 facts in it, and a couple of professors came out and said, "Oh no, it's all wrong." They chose 23 of the 2,000 facts to criticize. So that made national news, and so I'm now terrible at making up all my facts. Well, the book was pulled at that time, and it's coming out with a much larger national publisher, Simon & Schuster, and they would reprint my book only on the condition that I would add an extra chapter to tear up those two professors. So we did, and out of the 23 or so things that they found wrong, we showed that in 20 of them they were dead wrong. 3 of them is a matter of interpretation.
Did he say that we were recruited by secular guys?
Yeah, we were recruited by secular guys, and I can say with 100% certainty that I was certainly not recruited by anybody.
Well, unless I'm a secular guy, because I recruited you, right?
That's right.
Like right here at McDonald's.
It's like almost this very spot.
I mean, there may be some secular guys somewhere in this building, but at that time, but it wasn't me.
So here's the funny part is that I remember when you were telling me about David Barton, I had heard of him. Somebody had given me like America's Godly Heritage, but he wasn't anyone that academics who were writing about the founding engaged with. He wasn't anybody they wrote about. They didn't talk about his work. I mean, he didn't come to academic panels, right? So he was this person that I knew some homeschoolers read, but that was it. Like, he was just not on the radar. I mean, this is not just liberal academics or something. This is even, I moved in conservative academic circles, and he was just not on the radar screen.
Yeah, you were writing for, what was it called then? Not the Institute. It's called the Institute now, but what was it called then? The Center.
Oh, Center for Faith and Freedom, it was called? Or,
yeah,
it
was called Vision and Values then,
that's
wasn't
right.
it?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, you wrote for that.
Yeah.
Probably still do. Or
Yeah.
I don't know if you still do, but
I presented at several of their conferences.
As did I.
Yeah.
Not a secular institute.
Right.
We don't teach at a secular school.
That's right.
They don't actually allow that.
Yeah. I published that same year. In fact, earlier, like 2007 or 8, and then also came out in 2012, Encyclopedia of Catholic Social Teaching and Social Thought, which was, although published with an academic publisher, but it was a very, religious publication from a very particular religious viewpoint. So.
Not secular.
Not secular, right? Like my degrees are from Grove City College and from the University of Dallas. To University of Dallas is a Catholic university, so not secular.
Not secular.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so I was not recruited by secular guys.
Nope.
You were not recruited by secular guys. So I guess that is bonkers.
That's bonkers.
Okay.
I don't even know where, could be the origin of that. Like where, there's nothing either one of us have said that somebody came to us, secular or otherwise.
Right.
So I just don't even know where you'd begin.
Well, see, that's the thing. Yeah. See, there are times when I'm listening to Mr. Barton that I think, maybe he believes what he's saying. But then when he says something like that about me, and you, and I think, okay, now he does know that he is making that up. He's looking right in the camera, right in the microphone, and he's making stuff up.
Yeah.
Because he has no way to know anything like that. And in fact, it's not true.
Right. It's just made up.
So to summarize, the Where's Waldo of Christian nationalism, David Barton, said unnamed secular guys recruited us to point out the errors in the Jefferson lies, and then we recruited Discovery Institute Jay Richards to do the same thing. Then Simon & Schuster republished the Jefferson lies with a takedown of our book. Hey Waldo, your pantalones are on fire.
Walking through the morning, barely anyone to watch this scene. Milk trucks of Manhattan, and the willow branches tipped with green. But the season's going somewhere. Spring to spring and fall to fall. Things will walk a little further, 'cause the world awaits us all.
This is Warren Throckmorton, co-author along with Michael Coulter of Getting Jefferson Right, fact-checking claims about Thomas Jefferson. You're listening to the podcast series, Telling Jefferson Lies, a story about how history can be hijacked for ideological and political purposes. Today we tell the story of how David Barton's best-selling book about Thomas Jefferson was removed from publication due to historical errors. We also tell the story of Getting Jefferson Right, which was our response to the Jefferson lies, and how that story continues with the second edition, which came out on November 1st, 2023. This is also a broader story about the surge of Christian nationalism and the misuse of history which often goes along with it. Finally, we examine the consequences of believing myths and failing to get history right. This is Episode 3, The Cataclysm.
3 o'clock and cloudy. Bars are open down on Rivington Street. No call, no show, no work today. Wondering if this girl can get something to eat. Well, that job just took the breath from him, and the paycheck never sat too tall. Wants to give that girl the best he's got, 'cause the world awaits us all.
You have a brand new book called Jefferson Lies. Brought you on to talk about it when it came out. I read it through cover to cover, highlighted it, marked it up, dog-eared it. Great resource, terrific book, well-researched, heavily footnoted and documented. And yet, because of the effort of a man by the name of Warren Throckmorton, Thomas Nelson has decided to do something with that book. Catch us up to date.
Well, Thomas Nelson notified me that even though this is a New York Times best-selling book, that they're pulling the book. So without checking with us, they said they lack confidence in the book.
The facts are always important, even when we don't like them. For the Chuck Colson Center for Christian Worldview, I'm John Stonestreet with The Point. A few weeks ago, David Barton of Wall Builders and frequent guest on the Glenn Beck Show published a book called The Jefferson Lies, exposing myths you've always believed about Thomas Jefferson. But many historians think that it's Barton's book that's full of myths and inaccuracies about our third president. In fact, Dr. Jay Richards, a recent guest with me on Breakpoint this week, asked 10 Christian historians to assess Barton's work. Their responses were pretty negative, and now Barton's publisher has taken the book out of print and apologized.
In this episode, we want to tell you the story behind Getting Jefferson Right. Of necessity, that story is prior to explaining how and why David Barton's book, The Jefferson Lies, was pulled from publication by Thomas Nelson. Both stories will be told in this episode. Like almost everything else related to history, we have to correct the record as told by David Barton on this topic. As pointed out in the opening conversation with Michael Coulter, Barton told an Ohio audience in 2013 that unnamed secular guys recruited us to go after him. Barton simply made that up. Then, in his second edition of The Jefferson Lies, published by WorldNet Daily Press, not Simon & Schuster, as he claimed, Barton said that I recruited then Discovery Institute fellow Jay Richards to attack The Jefferson Lies. Barton wrote, Throckmorton admitted that he had recruited scholars for this purpose, led by Jay Richards, a philosopher-theologian with the Discovery Institute, who, according to media outlets, had asked 10 conservative Christian professors to assess Barton's work, end quote. While it is true that Richards was commissioned to recruit historians to evaluate our book and Barton's book, it is not true that I did the commissioning. In fact, Barton was aware of who commissioned Richards and many of the circumstances surrounding the situation. Let me explain. For many reasons, some of which I may go into in future episodes, I began to seriously investigate theological and political views of separation of church and state in late 2009. I first ran into Barton's work in 2010, and my first fact-checking blog post was in April 2011, refuting Barton's claim that Thomas Jefferson cut out all the red letters of Jesus and gave the compilation to Native Americans. In late 2011, I saw a notice online that Barton was bringing out a book on Jefferson. I had the idea to quickly write a white paper or a book compiling my posts about the third president. So I requested a pre-publication copy of The Jefferson Lies to see if Barton repeated the same mistake in his book as he did in his talks and interviews. I didn't think the publisher would send it because I had by that time gotten a reputation as a critic of Barton's work. But Thomas Nelson sent it, and I went to work. As time went on, I saw that the project needed to be more than a compilation of blog posts, so that's when I pitched the idea to my friend Michael Coulter. Along with the entire Grove City College history department, Michael had already been a valuable resource for my fact-checking efforts on political theory and church-state issues. It all went along very quickly. Thomas Nelson brought out The Jefferson Lies on April 10, 2012, and we brought out Getting Jefferson Right ebook on Amazon.com on May 1st. We then brought out a paperback with even more material in July 2012. So our little ebook took on Thomas Nelson and David Barton. We didn't have a clue what was coming. The first indication that Getting Jefferson Right might have an impact was a Facebook message to me from Jay Richards. It came on May 14th, just 2 weeks after we released the book. Richards wrote, Professor Throckmorton and Professor Coulter, thanks so much for writing this book. I read it over the weekend and was delighted to have all of these arguments against Barton's misleading treatment of Jefferson in one place. I'm going to contact some friends in Christian media to alert them to your critique, and I'm wondering if the book will be released in print or remain only in Kindle format. All the best, Jay Richards. As pointed out earlier, Barton claimed in the second edition of The Jefferson Lies that I admitted recruiting Jay Richards and other scholars to criticize his book. as this message demonstrates, that is completely false. Before the May 14 Facebook message, I did not know much about Jay Richards. I had seen his name associated with the Discovery Institute, and I associated that organization with intelligent design, a perspective on the origins of life on Earth that holds that the complexity of certain aspects of the universe requires an intelligent cause versus natural selection or natural causes. I would later learn that Richards was well connected with most big-name right-wing leaders and influencers, including Glenn Beck and James Robison. Initially, Richards' enthusiasm for the book extended to alerting his friends in the media. However, after a couple of weeks went by, we got this surprising note on May 23rd in response to a note from me asking if he had gotten any positive response from his media contacts. Richards wrote and said he was in the middle of a difficult mediation with Glenn Beck and James Robison. He said Robison spoke at length with David Barton. Richards then said a plan had been developed, adding, quote, "We're now talking about submitting the book, the lecture, your book, and a couple of other critiques of David's work to 6 independent historians and having them provide an evaluation," end quote. He said, quote, "I've already got a list of candidates and have contacted them about doing this. So the question is whether David will agree," end quote. I wrote back and expressed amazement at this development. Let's pause for a moment to consider who Jay Richards mentioned. First, he said Glenn Beck. Beck had been a major force behind Barton's rise to prominence. Remember what Beck said about Barton in 2011.
You have been a dear friend and trusted advisor. I think you are one of the most important men alive today.
When Jay Richards told me he was in difficult mediation with Glenn Beck, I realized that he was talking about one of Barton's most consequential supporters. James Robison is an evangelist, longtime Christian right-wing activist, and co-author with Richards of Indivisible. The book back cover says Individual examines, quote, "politics, faith, and culture from a Christian perspective, while providing groundbreaking arguments to unite people of faith with all who cherish freedom and limited government," end quote. At that point, the question was, as Richards wrote, whether Barton would agree to the whole intervention. The next day, Richards wrote to confirm the plan was in place. In a Facebook message, he wrote, quote, "Well, I was commissioned and have now lined up at least 6 Christian political scientists and historians who have agreed to participate in this independent review. In 2 weeks, I will be delivering a file with these reviews to those concerned, and then we will press for public corrections from David. Whether he will do that or not is still an open question, but no one whom I approached in Dallas treated this lightly, and everyone understood that I wouldn't have raised this issue without serious reasons." Clearly, Richards put himself on the line for this, and he believed the historians and political scientists he lined up would agree with him. Also, this email is another point of evidence that Barton probably knew I didn't recruit Richards and that I was not recruited by anybody, secular or otherwise. Richards was commissioned by one or more people in Dallas to pursue this fact-finding mission. According to Richards, Barton was confronted by James Robison about concerns over historical accuracy. I think everybody can agree that Robison is not a secular guy. In fact, Barton himself provided evidence that he knew Richards was doing his own recruitment. In a footnote written in a response to critics on his Wall Builders website, Barton describes Gregg Frazer's critique of him as a, quote, "hostile written review," end quote, and says it was written at the request of Jay Richards. In that footnote, Barton says that critique was given to him by James Robison. Barton also wrote that Jay Richards had given the hostile review to James Robison. Forget where's Waldo. Where are the secular guys? As is clear from these notes, the J. Richards intervention had accelerated from making the public aware of our book to a confrontation of David Barton about the Jefferson Lies and his historical work more broadly. Richards first mentioned 6 historians. In a June 4th message, he said the number had grown to 9. Somewhere along the way, I saw the number 10 quoted in media sources. I don't know all the historians who were contacted, but I was able to interview 4 of them: Greg Forster, Glenn Sunshine, Gregg Frazer, and Glenn Moots. Here's Gregg Frazer talking about his contact with J. Richards.
We communicated by email, and he told me that he was contacting 10 Christian historians, and he wanted each of us to do a part of Barton's work that he wanted to take. And as I understood it, he and one other guy were going to go and meet with Barton personally. So I was never part of meeting with him personally. And, in the response that Barton made, he said, that I didn't say hardly anything about the book, The Jefferson Lies, but that was because I was assigned to do that video that I reviewed, America's Godly Heritage. He split up the work among different people. And so the original thing that Jay set up was each of us, as I understand it, was given a particular assignment. And I had already done a significant review of America's Godly Heritage, and so that's what he asked me to do. So when he took materials, when he met with Barton personally, what he took from me was my several page, 8 or 10 page review of that particular video.
Frazer is a historian and Dean of Humanities at the Master's College in Santa Clarita, California. It was founded by conservative pastor John MacArthur. Barton likes to say his critics are all pagans and liberals. Frazer is no liberal, and the Master's College is no liberal college. Frazer is also the author of The Religious Beliefs of America's Founders, Reason, Revelation, and Revolution, a book which makes the case that many of the founders were neither Orthodox Christian nor deist, but rather more aligned with the system he calls, quote, theistic rationalism, end quote, a belief system that combined elements of Protestantism, nationalism, and reason, with reason being the decisive element. It is with that understanding and preparation that Frazer approached his assignment, which was to critique a video Barton produced in the early days of his ministry titled America's Godly Heritage. It is one of the earliest works Barton created, but edited versions are all over YouTube, and it is still sold on his website. It is often used in the homeschool world. Here's how Barton began the original version of America's Godly Heritage.
Does America really have a godly heritage? But did you realize that out of the 55 founding fathers who worked on the Constitution, that 52 out of the 55 were Orthodox evangelical Christians? We don't hear that part of our history anymore.
Frazer told Richards that this claim about the 52 founders and many other claims in the video weren't accurate. Frazer summarized his critique by writing, quote, America's Godly Heritage is a relatively early work by David Barton, and I would like to be able to say that he has corrected his historiography and to affirm his later work as a significant improvement. Unfortunately, that is not the case. While he has distanced himself from a few of the specific inaccuracies in this video, his approach has not changed, except to find new avenues of misrepresentation and overstatement. End quote. You might remember that in past episodes, Frazer called Barton a propagandist. That's not all Frazer has to say.
Well, a couple of things I thought were interesting in the World articles. I did my World article, and then Barton wrote a short rebuttal in which he says something really interesting. He said, the article managed to avoid the book's major points and instead criticize minor and even obscure facts. So the interesting thing is this sort of tells you a lot about the way Barton sees things. It's okay if facts are wrong. The big picture is more important than having the facts. And then he says that it'd be misuse of time and energy to continue arguing over relatively inconsequential points, which I was pointing out ways in which he was wrong in his claims about Jefferson believing in Orthodox Christianity, which is the main point, I thought. But anyway, he says it would be a misuse of time and energy to continue arguing over inconsequential points with those who profess blah, blah, blah. I will now resume my efforts attempting to beat back the secularist progressive movement. So I finished my response by saying what has been in question all along is not Barton standing as a cultural battler, but is standing as a historian. And that's the issue. So, I don't question he's a cultural battler and so on, and stemming back the progressive tide, whatever. I don't really care about that. But the issue is he a historian, and how does he write history, not how well does he stem the progressive tide?
Richards also contacted Glenn Sunshine, then a professor at Central Connecticut State University. Richards and Sunshine had worked together on a project for the Acton Center, a conservative think tank in Washington, D.C. On the basis of that project, Richards felt Sunshine could provide reliable feedback. Here's Sunshine talking about Richards commissioning him to read the Jefferson Lies.
And what he did was send me a note letting me know that David Barton had written this book, and that he thought that there were real problems with it, and wanted my reaction to it and any input that I could give. So I got hold of a copy and read the thing through and basically gave him my overall impressions, which were not terribly favorable, frankly.
I asked Sunshine why Richards called him for the project.
Well, he knew that I was a historian, and he knew that I had done work related to ideas of liberty and so on. Again, I was one of the consultants for The Birth of Freedom, one of the talking heads on it. And in a lot of ways, that particular documentary produced by Acton came out of a book that I wrote that they gave me a book grant for called Why You Think the Way You Do. So I think he figured that I would have some good input on it.
The Acton Institute for Religion and Liberty is a conservative think tank advocating for religion in the public square. This is not a secularist, left-leaning organization. The Acton Institute says they produced The Birth of Freedom to keep alive the knowledge of the role religion has played historically in the birth, growth, and securing of freedom in the United States. Sunshine told me he has used materials produced by wall builders and isn't necessarily opposed to some of their aims. He is, however, opposed to biased history. This is why he agreed to the request J. Richards posed to him. The third historian I was able to interview was Glenn Moots, professor of political science and philosophy at Northwood University in Midland, Michigan. When you go to Northwood's website, the front page welcomes you with the slogan, "Welcome to America's Free Enterprise University." Moots described to me how he was recruited.
I actually remember the phone call. I don't think I initially spoke to Jay. I think I initially spoke with Greg Forster. And I know Greg had a piece that came out, and Greg and I knew one another because we had both worked on Locke in the past and we had been on panels together. And Greg's a good friend. Greg's been a really, really fine friend over the years. So I'm the kind of person who, when a friend asks you to consider something, you say yes. So I knew some things about David Barton. I appreciated some of the observations and insights that he had made. That said, I think we were in agreement, Greg, myself, and Jay, and some other folks that I talked to, that if you wanted to advance the idea that Christianity was significant in early America or had some relevance for at least historical American politics, the question of contemporary politics, of course, is an overlapping but somewhat separate conversation. You didn't want to overplay your hand. And that's exactly what was going on. And so we found ourselves in agreement with Barton in some ways, but in very significant disagreement with him in others.
Moots tried to recruit a few other colleagues, but wasn't successful. He also said that historian Thomas Kidd was involved in some way and that he collected some of the information and eventually played the role of a journalist by writing an article about the controversy for World Magazine.
And what was also interesting about this is that Tommy Kidd, who was at Baylor, he's at a Baptist seminary now, I can't remember which one, but I think he was probably the most qualified of all of us. I don't think there was anybody better qualified to speak to Jefferson in early America. But Tommy sort of played the journalist on this because he's the one that wrote The Peace and World. And I found that interesting. But the request was to try to get a network of Christian scholars who were willing to challenge Barton's claims and also realize the significance that we didn't want to look like unscholarly. How's that? And wind up subjecting ourselves to a lot of unnecessary criticism. So Barton was going to do that. He was going to subject those of us who were willing to have a reasonable conversation about the role of Christianity in the founding. That those kind of claims that he was making were not going to help the case.
Historian Greg Forster was contacted due to his expertise regarding political theorist and philosopher John Locke. Barton mentioned Locke in the Jefferson Lies, and both Richards and Glenn Moots wanted Forster's opinion about Barton's handling of Locke. It wasn't flattering.
I'm not a Jefferson scholar, but I am a Locke scholar, and Barton had a page on his website at that time about John Locke and his role contributing ideas that were important in the American founding. And since there was a controversy going on, and I was blogging at that time at the First Thoughts, which was the blog of First Things, and still is, although I'm no longer there, I thought I'll stick my oar in as somebody who has related expertise. So I wrote a lengthy evaluation for the blog of David Barton's writings on John Locke, which I found to be historically very irresponsible.
Greg's oar in the water was more like a hammer. It was published in the popular web magazine First Things on August 8, 2012, the same day Tommy Kidd wrote about the controversy over the Jefferson Lies, and the day before, Thomas Nelson confirmed they had pulled Barton's book from the shelves. Barton also claimed that Locke quoted the Bible 1,500 times in his two treatises on government. Forster told me that Barton's claim morphed a bit in his second Jefferson book, but not towards accuracy.
Jefferson is a big fan of Locke, and Barton is correct to emphasize that Jefferson really liked Locke, but he's incorrect to portray Locke as a massively influential figure in the United States. Now, I think you could make a case that people who were influenced by Locke were also influential in the United States. So, for example, the classic legal writer Blackstone was influenced by Locke, and Blackstone is cited extensively in the Federalist Papers. So if you wanted to, I think you could make a case that Locke's ideas are more influential than it might appear from the number of people who are reading Locke. But Barton's not doing that. Barton just says Locke was widely read in America, and that's just not the case. It's not true. Another issue, and one on which he has moved further away from accuracy, is the notorious 1,500 Bible verses. In the original Locke material on his website, he said that the two treatises of government cite 1,500 Bible verses in the course of its argument. Now, let me just parenthetically remark, many people think that the two treatises of government does not cite the Bible at all or does not make an important biblical argument. There's more Bible in there than many people appreciate, right? And if Barton could just stick to factually accurate versions of this, we'd have a much easier time. It is true there's more Bible in the two treatises than most people are aware, but you and I had a conversation. I remember we were scratching our heads thinking, where did he get this 1,500 number? So I looked in the index of my edition and I counted the number of Bible verses that were in the index. And I said, it's not 1,500. It's not close to 1,500. So where's the number from? And I think you said hey, he cites a whole book. I think it was the book of Proverbs, wasn't it? At one point, Locke mentions the book of Proverbs. You don't think Barton actually counted the number of verses in the book of Proverbs and added that to the total number of Bible verses? And when you added the number, it turned out, yep, that's right. That's where he got his 1,500 number. So that was in the website. It's worse now. It's worse now. Because in the new edition of the Jefferson Lies, he doesn't say cites 1,500 Bible verses. He says cites the Bible 1,500 times, which is, a step removed from the already unjustifiable, irresponsible stretch that he was making earlier. So, yes, there's Bible in Locke's 2 treatises of government, but not 1,500 times.
In the next episode, we will examine in much more detail what was wrong with the Jefferson Lies. What Forster says here is just a foretaste. In addition to the summer of commissioning, Barton faced 2 additional challenges. Both challenges peripherally involved getting Jefferson right. As with J. Richard's intervention, we had no role in bringing them about. In a sense, we were in the right place at the right time. The good folks at the History News Network decided to host a contest of sorts. They took nominations from their members for a poll they titled The Least Credible History Book in Print. It was anything but scientific. The editors of the network chose the books which got the most nominations and allowed anybody to vote for 1 week between July 9th and July 16th. Editor Rick Shinkman had an idea to take a poll. Managing editor at the time, David Austin Walsh, describes the rationale.
So we had sort of a reputation of being a source for critical takes on bad scholarship. So when we designed the poll, though, I think the idea was that we weren't just going to go after, or it wasn't going to be about bad history books written by university professors per se, but we wanted to have it be as expansive as possible because, well, the most popular history books are written by people like Bill O'Reilly. So yeah, the idea was that we would solicit, and we also wanted to try to keep this as outside of our editorial control as possible, which is to say that we, if I remember correctly, the way the poll was structured was we solicited in our newsletter nominations. Sort of kept a tally of them, and then I think it was the top 5 or top 10 people would then vote on. But the top, obviously there was David Barton's book, there was Howard Zinn, I think O'Reilly was on there too. I can't remember who else, but that's sort of how that decision was made. And again, the idea was that we wanted it to be a reader-driven poll as opposed to something that we would select ourselves.
The project got a boost when Jennifer Schuessler, reporting for the Artsbeat section of the New York Times, wrote a favorable piece about the poll. Schuessler wrote, "On July 9, the top 5 nominees will be posted on the site, which is hosted by George Mason University. Readers then will be asked to vote for, quote, the least credible history book in print, end quote. The winner, or loser, will be announced on July 16, along with commentary on the finalists from various academic historians who make up the bulk of the site's contributors. We, meaning Throckmorton and Coulter, were asked by Walsh to offer commentary on the Jefferson Lies. That certainly didn't hurt the visibility of our book. When all the votes were counted, David Barton's The Jefferson Lies won by 2 votes over Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States. The New York Times, Schuessler trumpeted the results, writing, "After a week of voting by readers, David Barton's The Jefferson Lies won with some 650 votes, narrowly edging the left-wing historian Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, which received 641 votes. Trailing far behind were Bill O'Reilly and Martin Duguid's Killing Lincoln, which argues that Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton was complicit in Lincoln's assassination. Thomas D. Lorenzo's The Real Lincoln, a new look at Abraham Lincoln, his agenda, and an unnecessary war, and Gavin Mincy's 1421, the year China discovered America. Of course, it didn't hurt our cause to be the champions of the Jefferson Lies status as winner. We got some positive space in the New York Times. Schuessler wrote, "To many voters, the badness of the Jefferson Lies, which argues, among other things, that Jefferson in fact saw no need for a wall of separation between church and state, was a truth held to be self-evident. In expert commentary solicited by the network, which is hosted by George Mason University, Warren Throckmorton and Michael Coulter, the authors of Getting Jefferson Right, denounced Mr. Barton's distortions, writing, quote, "As Jefferson did with the Gospels, Barton chooses what he likes about Jefferson and leaves out the rest to create a result more in line with his ideology," end quote. Publicity like that's hard to come by, but at the time for David Barton, it was hard to overcome. However, his no good, very bad summer wasn't over. In July and August of 2012, there was trouble brewing in River City. The River City of Cincinnati, that is. Trouble starts with T and rhymes with B, and that stands for boycott. Pastors Ray McMillian, Chris Beard, and others organized a group of their peers and a few historians to oppose Barton's The Jefferson Lies. In a press release dated August 1st, 2012, a group describing themselves as, quote, African American, white, and Messianic Jewish pastors and church leaders, end quote, objected to the Jefferson Lies for 4 basic reasons. So here they are. 1. It glosses over Thomas Jefferson's unorthodox and heretical beliefs about Jesus Christ. 2. It minimizes and justifies Thomas Jefferson's racism. 3. It excuses Thomas Jefferson's practice of enslaving African Americans. 4. The Jefferson Lies is riddled with factual distortions and falsehoods. Historian Dr. Troy Jackson said in the release, quote, "This book is inaccurate, this book is offensive, and this book is dangerous," end quote. Here is Troy Jackson in 2023.
That's 11 years ago, and I guess where I would go with it now is that I think I was right, and not just the book, but the movement that David Barton has been a part of to cast our history in a way that is melded to a particular ideology, that is cut and paste history, that lifts quotes out of context, that actually ignores evidence that contradicts the thesis of the book. Those are the things I saw in Jefferson's Lies. And it was just 3 years later when our former president went down the escalator and has launched a political career. Well, actually, you could go back even further to the birther controversy our former president was part of. But I think some of the seeds of that are in the approach to history, the cynical approach to history, and to me, an approach that that has a thesis and then looks for evidence to support the thesis and ignores any evidence that contradicts it. Can lead to some very dangerous things in our nation, in our politics, and in the church.
One of the leaders of that coalition was Oasis Church pastor Ray McMillian. Pastor McMillian endorsed Getting Jefferson Right and implored Thomas Nelson to remove Barton's book from publication. According to Troy Jackson, McMillian had been working to raise awareness for many years.
This is what Pastor Ray McMillian gathered us around him 25 plus years ago, was calling Jefferson and the founders Christian heroes, not recognizing, one, that many of them were not really Christian, and two, to simply explain away their complicity with the hideous institution of slavery and white supremacy. So I think that there was that sense, I think, is part of the risk. And then when we don't tell our history, there's honestly, the dehumanization of Black, Indigenous people of color is ripe for the picking.
We will hear from Jackson more later in the series, but for now, let it sink in that Christian nationalism and American origin stories sound different to people of color than they do to many members of the white majority. Barton had clearly touched a nerve. What happened during the last week of July and the first week of August is not entirely clear to me, but there was at least a letter and a meeting of confrontation. On July 31st, Richards emailed to say that, quote, "There's a cataclysm in process. I suspect some public report today or tomorrow," end quote. At least one aspect of the cataclysm was made public by Barton on August 2nd. Speaking on a radio program, Barton said that some of the scholars who disagreed with him on his book were coming to Aledo for a meeting that night. The next day, he said on Glenn Beck's Blaze Network that the meeting had taken place and he had prevailed. Jay Richards told me the meeting was surreal and lasted 4.5 hours. He said Barton was cordial, but that he was resistant to acknowledging mistakes. Richards told me on at least 3 different occasions that Barton told him that as a political entity, he, meaning Barton, could not publicly acknowledge errors. Let that sink in a minute. Apparently, being a political entity means never having to say you're sorry. Another aspect of the Cataclysm was a scathing article by historian Thomas Kidd, published in World magazine on August 7. In it, Kidd outlined the commissioning that Richards had received and quoted the negative comments of Glenn Moots, Glenn Sunshine, and Gregg Frazer. As promised by Richards, the first negative comments from him appeared in print. Kidd wrote, quote, "Richards argues that Barton's books and videos are full of embarrassing factual errors, suspiciously selective quotes, and highly misleading claims," end quote. From previous communication with Richards, I surmised that Barton was offered a proposition: clean up your facts or face negative publicity from Christian leaders. Since the negative public statement came from Richards, I assumed there was going to be follow-through from others besides him. However, this didn't happen. In fact, Glenn Beck doubled down and threw Barton a very significant lifeline. To my knowledge, James Robeson never made any public statement. Despite significant lobbying from the Cincinnati pastors, Tony Evans remained silent. At one point, I got an email from Richards saying they were in mid-cataclysm and to expect some additional big news. It wasn't long after that I got a call from Bob Smietana reporting for the Tennessean. Sometime during the Cataclysm, Thomas Nelson pulled the book from publication without public fanfare. Journalist Bob Smietana, then with the Nashville Tennessean, was interested in the controversy brewing over the book and called Thomas Nelson about it. When he did, he got more news about the Jefferson Lies than he expected.
I remember asking about that book because of all the chatter around the work you guys were doing, that you were doing and other historians. Like, the book had made this big splash, and then there was all the controversy about it, and it was kind of roiling. And so it could have been someone else at the paper that tipped me that this was coming. I just remember calling them, and I don't have my Tennessee emails from back then. Or if I do, I can't get at them. That someone had tipped me that something was coming, and I remember calling them. They're like, "Yep, here's our statement." So it could have either been someone tipped me, or I know that I was looking into it because it had gotten so much attention. When it came out, it was a bestseller, and there was so much. What was interesting to me was that there was so much attention, not from the normal critics of him, sort of, more progressive folks or sort of mainline historians, but from people in his own tribe. When, World Magazine is writing about him, and World probably had some philosophical affiliations with him. Like they liked the idea that God was active in politics and American culture. They would have, that was not a foreign idea to them, but his work was just seen as so bad that that's what made the story interesting. This is, a story, historians criticize David Barton
for being theocratic is or wrong is, like sort of dog bites man, right? Normal story. The, conservative scholars say David Barton is full of it, is, man bites dog story. That's a story. Yeah, it was a front page story. So it came out the next day, because the minute we had it, we were calling folks to say, what does this all mean? And it's a good story. So a story like that is, for a reporter, is great because you already have all the background material in your head. You already know there's something here, and then something happens to move it forward, and then it's on the front page of the newspaper.
World Magazine was the first publication in print with an article by historian Thomas Kidd. Previously, on August 7, Kidd had written a story on the controversy over Barton's book and the gathering clouds over his lack of historical accuracy. As I have learned, Kidd was privy to the behind-the-scenes confrontation taking place with Jay Richards and the historians. It all culminated into an unprecedented move for one of the largest Christian publishers in the world. I was surprised but impressed that Thomas Nelson did the right thing. I have since learned that there wasn't much debate once the decision-makers learned how extensive the problems were. They felt they had to keep faith with their readers. No one from Thomas Nelson would agree to speak publicly, but the comments I have were made on condition of anonymity. It was clear that our book contributed to the decision and review of the situation. Back to the behind-the-scenes operation in Dallas. As the summer wore on, it became clear to me that none of those who knew about the problems were going to come forward. Jay Richards had good intentions and really expended a tremendous amount of effort and political and personal capital to make an intervention. However, the people he talked to did not force the issue. In fact, Glenn Beck confirmed the existence of the Cataclysm, but stood by his man.
At the Restoring Love event, there were meetings that were going on. And right after the event, I received a letter from a prominent Christian that had just unleashed on David. In this letter, they claimed, quote, David was not trustworthy in his treatment of the founders and the circumstances surrounding the founding of America, and therefore they could, quote, not depend on any work being done by wall builders, end quote.
Shortly after the news hit, Beck gave Barton an unchallenged platform on his show to spin the situation. For an academic, having a book disgraced like that would be a serious blow. However, it has not stopped Barton from spreading the Christian nationalist gospel. In fact, arguably, he has more influence than ever. In the previous episode, we began to examine the appeal of questionable experts and tribal loyalties, and will continue to unpack that as we move along. Even though there has been some change due to the removal of the Jefferson Lies, Christian nationalism history still has too much influence. However, in the year after the Jefferson Lies was pulled from publication, there was a time of reflection. Many Christian leaders confronted the false narratives and made baby steps toward change. However, after about a year, the conspiracy of silence returned, and Barton and Christian nationalist history regained solid standing among Christian groups. With a few exceptions, this is the situation today. The rest of the series unpacks that. Finally, we haven't talked much in this episode about what Barton got wrong about Jefferson. We have focused on the controversy and the rise and fall of the Jefferson Lies. Next episode, we will examine the faulty history about Jefferson. In other words, when Thomas Nelson said they lost confidence in the book's facts, what did they mean? What was so wrong about the Jefferson Lies that we had to get Jefferson right? In the next episode, Getting Jefferson Right, we will discuss the problems with the Jefferson Lies. What is wrong with Barton's stories about the Jefferson Bible, Jefferson's record on slavery, the separation of church and state, Jefferson's religious views, and more? We will get specific. Telling Jefferson Lies is written and produced by Warren Throckmorton. Today's installment was hosted by Warren Throckmorton and Michael Coulter. The podcast is brought to you by the second edition of Getting Jefferson Right, fact-checking claims about Thomas Jefferson by Throckmorton and Coulter, and available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, just about anywhere books are sold. For more information, go to gettingjeffersonright.com. Today's closing song is Sparkle by Dustin Blatnick. Telling Jefferson Lies theme song is The World Awaits Us All by Roman Candle. Background music was provided by Jonathan Swaim, Dustin Blatnick, Larry Norman, and Warren Throckmorton. Dreams on a Gray Afternoon appears courtesy of Charles Norman and the Larry Norman Estate. See the show notes for more credits. Please like the episode and spread the word on social media. Every podcaster says that, but it really does help, and it makes us feel good too. Thanks for listening.